Did anybody in the room at any point of your schooling run track or cross country? Anybody? We have no runners in the... Oh, a few people. Okay. Did anybody do like distance running in track or anything other than just simply sprints? Yeah, a few people. So, okay, I expected maybe a larger group of people to be able to answer the question, but we'll see what happens. If I were to ask those of you who did participate in those athletic disciplines, what is the main mistake that new runners make, especially before like a first major competition in the running world? What would it be? Bad shoes. I mean that'll get you if your shoe comes off. I'm thinking more in terms of like coachable athletic form. What could be the mistake? All right. Hey, not stretching could be disastrous. You never know. But here's what often happens for newbies running track or cross country. Believe it or not, I used to run distance. Keyword used to. Now I distance. I still run from time to time, but my run is a much slower pace. My knees hurt. Surprise, surprise. No, the number one mistake that new runners make when they're lining up on the blocks for a track event or starting off at the starting line for a cross-country event is they start too fast. They just rip and tear out of there. And midway through, whether it's like just a couple laps around a track or a quarter mile into a run, you find all the people that you were trying to lead because you psychologically needed to be in first place starting to pass you. Because maintaining a lead, staying in first is harder than you think. In fact, people have started to master this. And even the animal world masters this. They know being in first the whole time in a race doesn't make a lot of sense. Because when you're doing that, you're taking all the wind. Anybody watch NASCAR? You don't have to run to watch NASCAR. I don't watch NASCAR, but I do know that being in the lead is a hard place to be. Defensive driving all the time. And it wears out your tires and it runs out your gas a lot faster. And you don't have the same horsepower because you've got wind resistance. But if you have somebody tailing you and they're within the little pocket where the air doesn't have to dip down and hit the grill again. It can kind of shoot back over them. What's that called? Drafting, right? And it makes the race easier. It preserves what? Want to make sure I get that one right. Oh, dear. Okay. Yes, drafting helps you preserve gas. It allows you to even have kind of like you can put the pedal to the metal and zip around somebody and have it advance. Here's what I mean. The book of Hebrews is a sermon. I know some of you think I preach occasionally too long or too heady of sermons. Could you imagine sitting through the book of Hebrews as a sermon? It could be worse, is all I'm saying. I think by the time the author of Hebrews gets to chapter 12, he thinks, I have written a stellar sermon. It's good. And if you like dark roast coffee, it is good. Like, it's deep, it's rich. If you're talking to a Jew, like, you're hitting some of the main things that they're worried about. I think he's concerned, maybe, just maybe, I've gotten everybody a little too excited. My sermon is too good. I never have this feeling. The sermon is just too good. And if I don't talk about the next leg of the race, not just worrying about how do we get out of the starting block and how do we gain a lead, but how do we endure through the Christian life, then maybe people are going to flame out. Maybe with exuberance, they're going to jump out of the starting gates and they're going to follow Christ. And have you ever gone to a camp meeting, a conference, or even come out of a church service and you're like, whew, God spoke to me. I'm on fire. I'm fired up. I'm ready to rumble. And you're thinking, and maybe you're talking with your spouse or your significant other about all the ways you're going to make all these different life changes, sweeping changes all at once because you're on fire. And 2 weeks later, you are emotionally and spiritually just like trashed. You're tired. Has anybody in the room ever felt like you've had a problem with spiritual endurance? Like I have. Trying to keep the flame alive. A lot of us can like use a lighter and kick it on, but like it takes fuel to continue to have the flame burning, right? I think the author of Hebrews is worried maybe I'm going to have people jumping out of the starting gates and flame out of the race if we don't talk about what it means to have patience and endure in the Christian faith. This is something I'm passionate about, and I love Hebrews chapter 12. Because to walk this Christian life in this hard world, it takes endurance. It takes patience. It takes developing some muscle memory and some spiritual calluses along the way. So today, I think we're going to be taught by the greatest distance coach ever, the author of Hebrews. Are you ready? Or do you need a quick stretch? We don't want to start off without stretching, right? I mean, there's actually a whole debate about whether or not stretching before your muscles are warmed up is helpful or hurtful. Here's how the author of Hebrews describes running the race of the Christian faith. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. I have a question for you before I start to break it down. Because the analogy of a race, if you've played any kind of sport, or if you just have a competitive nature, is going to probably elicit in you a competitive response. Anybody feel like that? Like if there's a race, I'm going to try to win it. It doesn't matter how out of shape I am or how hurt I am the next day. So, who or what are we running against in this race? Because I feel like so many of us in practice judge our running form based on other Christians around us. We're worried about staying in the lead, or at least not getting lapped. We analyze our form, which is built for us because we're all uniquely gifted by the Spirit, and we see somebody else's form and we think, I wish I was running the faith like that. The illustration of running the race of the Christian life is not putting you against me or you against any other Christian. It's actually not a competition within the family of God. It's a competition against sin. That's what you're running against. And what you're running to is the prize of Christ for eternity. The goal then is not to outpace or outrun your fellow Christian, but to use them as a resource. Let's do some drafting. If somebody's got a leg up in better form, learn from them. Don't envy them or critique them. We're running this race together. It's a competition. Don't get me wrong. But it's a competition against the sin that so easily entangles us and wants to trip us up, not against one another. If we get this right, I think church world would look a lot different. You're not running against other people. You're running with them for the cause of Christ. Now, this first passage, it's densely packed. That's the book of Hebrews for you. But I think we get three primary ways that we should be training ourselves to run this race with endurance. The first one is this. The call is to throw off the stuff that is slowing you down and avoid tripping hazards, which I think is hilarious. It's like you're running the 1,000-meter and somebody started setting up for hurdles in the middle of your race, and you come around the bend, you're like, ah! Like, what's that obstacle? It's kind of funny. It's like, don't even try to jump over it. Like, run around it is almost the imagery here. Now, it's amazing to me and sad. And I felt this sadness even like internally in myself. How many Christians want to run the race of faith weighed down by sinful baggage that Jesus has already paid for and taken off your shoulders? It's like the chains are on the ground next to us, and we should be running with joyful exuberance. Instead, we say, I think I'm going to need to put those on before I start running my race. And we do this backwards. We're supposed to, according to the author of Hebrews, throw off things like guilt and shame and insecurity. Not try to run with them, because you're going to get winded real fast. Those things are heavy, and your joints will hurt. You'll get up out of bed the next day and feel like, I don't think I can run today. Because we're carrying the wrong things. The author of He-Brews is like, get that stuff off. Like, no one runs in a trash bag. But so many of us, unless you're trying to lose weight, and that's dangerous. But you're not trash. Even if you think you are. You're God's prized possession. Take off the trash bag. Why are you sweating so much and putting so much effort into a race that God has said we are called to run with joyful exuberance and endurance? Throw off the stuff that's messing with you. And when it pops up surprisingly in the middle of the race, don't get so overwhelmed by it that you lose track of your form or you trip and you fall. Other people have had the same sort of struggles before. And I think the author of Hebrews wants us to have consciously in our mind that Jesus has already been tempted in every way and tried and been victorious. You can too. Don't worry about the hurdles that are going to come. They don't have to trip you up unless you give them the power. Throw off the stuff that's slowing you down. Avoid tripping hazards. And the next one is develop endurance and patience. There is no shortcut to developing endurance. So many people at the beginning of January probably started running or doing some sort of cardio exercise at a gym, and if you're super brave, outside, because it burns your lungs. And so many people are going to stop before they've been running consistently for 2 months because their muscles have not had the opportunity to develop endurance, where you wake up and don't feel sore anymore, where the pump and the kind of the pain and the stiffness goes from something you hate to something you actually crave. Now, if you're doing muscle confusion and constantly stepping up your game, you're going to continue to be sore, for sure. But I think the illustration can hold. We have to develop endurance and patience, and there is no shortcut in the race of the Christian faith. And it's not always pleasant, but we'll talk a whole lot more about that. Finally, we are called, most importantly, to fix our eyes on Jesus, which means you're not looking at your feet when you run, concerned about every step. You're not looking forward for the next obstacle that's going to pop up in your way. That's not the way we run the race effectively and develop endurance. We fix our eyes on Jesus, who is, according to the text, the author and the perfecter of our faith. I want to dive into those two terms because I think we can maybe talk about them slightly differently in a way that's going to change the way you run your race. So the first one, the word that's oftentimes translated author, I think it was initiator in the version that I read, is this. And it's appropriate because Jesus is the initiator of our faith and the author. He devised it, correct? But here is the component to this term that I think we've lost sight of, and we think we have to be this. He's the pioneer who trailblazes. He didn't just start the race. He has set the steps in order. He has carved out the path that you follow in. So think about this in terms of walking in the snow. You guys just did this probably the past couple of days. I thought it was funny. Yesterday when I was trying to get out of my back door to get into my garage, to lift up the garage door and allow Jeff and Michael to get in and work on the snowblower that doesn't work conveniently for the week, I had to blaze these huge holes with my feet because the snow back there had largely been untouched, and they went deep and it got into my socks and it was unpleasant. I had Bryn with me, my 3-year-old. You know what she intuitively did? She stepped in the holes that I created with my feet. So the snow didn't get in her boots as much. And it wasn't as hard. In fact, when I look back, she had a smile on her face. I didn't have a smile. Here's why I think this matters. Jesus has walked the uphill path, and he has figured out the places that are slippery or not. Follow his steps. On the snowy parts of cold and bitterness and where you're confused and life feels like a barren wasteland or it's just like sand and it's hot, step where he steps. It's going to be easier. He didn't just start the faith. He blazed the trail. You don't have to figure it out yourself. He's done it, and he's told us how to do it. And the primary way we do it, according to the author of Hebrews, is to keep our eyes on him right now. You know what that means? He didn't just finish the race and disappear, and he's not just resting. He's walking with you. The scriptures say that he sends his Holy Spirit to lead you in all truth. In order to lead somebody, you have to be in front of them. Let me tell you, Jesus, draft behind him. Run the race with endurance by following the one who's already won. That's the ticket. I'm going to skip my other illustration. Okay, he wasn't just the initiator or the trailblazer, though. We also get this word that he is the perfecter. And this comes from the Greek word telos, which means the goal, which I think is interesting. We need to think about this not just in eschatological terms, which means the last things, which would be the goal of all salvation history. It's not just the end at the total culmination of the universe. It's also right in front of you. This is so important to grasp. Jesus is your end goal. You want to be with him in eternity, sharing in the love of God forever. But that goal is not just in the future. It's 3 feet in front of you. The author of Hebrews says, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus because he's not just there. He's 3 feet in front of you. Which means when it's hard to take the next step, don't necessarily worry about the end game. Just worry about keeping your eyes on Jesus because that goal in your life is hard enough. But according to the text, it actually is a goal, and it's the perfect one. So don't get distracted throughout the course of your race. If it seems too big and it's like, man, there's so much longer to run, don't worry about the end goal. Worry about the author and perfecter of your faith who's right in front of you. Focus your eyes on him. Draft. He has the strength to keep you going. Just remain lock and step with him. You're not blazing the trail. He's doing that. Just keep your eyes on him. You may not feel like it, but doing so, you might find a new gear in your life, in your spiritual life. Like when you're running uphill, things can be tough, but you might develop a new way to do it. I used to end my runs by running uphill, which is not normal. But I waited for that last deep burn. And what I would do is I kind of sink my stance down, lower my gravity, and extend my stride. And it would use a different muscle group. So even though I was tired from before, I had like a new burst in me. You might just find that when you're exhausted and at the brink of collapse, what it feels like for you spiritually, if you keep your eyes on Jesus, who's not just way out there, but is right in front of you, you might develop a new gear, a new gift from the Holy Spirit to persevere in faith and endure. Here's how Jesus runs the race. We have a model. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, and this is the back half. It says, because of the joy awaiting him, Jesus endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he's seated at the place of honor beside God's throne. Here's a question for you. According to this passage, in order to look like Jesus, and remember he's your goal right in front of you, what might it look like in your life to disregard the shame of your current struggles? I tell you what, I've been there. If you're trying to run 3 miles, and at the end of 2 miles, you're breathing super heavy, and all you're doing is focusing on how heavy your breathing is, you don't sink back into the zone. But if you're able instead to focus on something different, maybe get into a groove, put on a good power running song, look further down the street, and get your mind off of the current struggle and shame. I'm too fat. I'm way out of shape. I'm never going to be able to get there anymore. Have you told yourself stuff like that spiritually? I'm too far gone. I'm never going to get over this. Why would God even want me? I might as well just start walking, and maybe in a different direction. Jesus, moving towards the cross, carrying it, we are told, endures the cross by disregarding the shame associated with it. What might it look like in your life if you disregarded the shame of your current struggles? If you have the KJV, like an older translation, you might instead have it translated, Jesus despising the shame of the cross, which you might think is different, but I actually don't think it is. I think it's kind of two sides of the same emotional coin as I was thinking about it this week. Ultimately, it's a distinction without difference. If we disregard the power that shame has in our life, we're able to not focus on it and instead focus on who God says we are. That's helpful. In the same way, if we despise the shame that exists in our life, what does that motivate us to do? To instead pursue the things that God has planned out for us. And what's amazing is, Jesus, disregarding the shame of the cross, doesn't fail. Because the cross isn't the end of his story. Which tells me that whatever struggle you're in your race right now is not your end. Because if you're trusting in Jesus, he's already won your prize. You're not heading to death and destruction. You might just be feeling the spiritual burn at the moment. And honestly, maybe that's not so bad. Sucks in the moment, to be sure. But it teaches us. And it instructs us. Many of us are weighed down by our own guilt and shame inside. And so we're haunted. And we have to figure out what sort of mechanisms can we build into our life? What voices can we listen to allow us to overcome the negative thoughts that we have ourselves? The scriptures talk about this in terms of us having a sinful nature. Something that's not just outside, but it's rotting us from the inside. But Jesus has the power to actually deal with that too. Maybe we start to do that by disregarding the shame of our current circumstances and all of the sin that we've committed, the sin that we still feel, and instead fix our eyes on Christ, who didn't cave under the worst of all circumstances. Now, Jesus, though, didn't just deal with like the internal, I don't want to do this, though he did. Do you remember when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane? God, I don't want this. Suffering is not fun. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, today I'm really hoping to suffer. I mean, that would be the icing on the cake. But he says, I'm willing to do it because I know the prize. I know the end goal. Not my will, but yours. I know there's a plan and a purpose. If you can disregard the shame of your current circumstances and use the mind of Christ to say, despite what's happening, he has a plan and a purpose for me, and I know it's good, we can overcome the inside stuff. But you know what really stinks? I've seen this to be, or found this to be the case in my life, and it seems like it happens in others as well. Have you ever overcome, or at least thought you're on the edge of overcoming some negative thought patterns or sinful behaviors, and like you're finally giving yourself a little bit of credit? No more defeatist thinking. And it's just been something that you've been struggling with as a personal insecurity. And you're like, today's the day, God. I'm over it. Thank you, by your grace. And then you go to work, and your boss verbalizes the exact words that you've been telling yourself for a year and finally thought you were over, and it just derails you. Or you're dealing with some kind of insecurity and then your spouse puts their finger right on it unsuspectingly, and it just like throws you for a loop. Temptation, shame, and guilt, it's not just internal, it can be external too. But did you know that Jesus figured out how to deal with that as well, running the race? Verse 3, think of all of the hostility he endured from sinful people. Think about this. As he's carrying this cross, he's literally getting spit on, cursed at, probably punched and kicked, maybe having some things hurled at him. Think of the hostility he endured, and then you won't become weary and give up because he's right in front of you. You won't become weary and give up. After all, you've not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin. The text actually says you've not bled for this yet. And in the words of a wonderful but, funny but not so great comedy, nobody makes me bleed my own blood. That can actually, though, be a moniker for your life, spiritually speaking. Nothing that anyone throws at me is going to derail me, because nothing that was thrown at Jesus derailed him. And I'm not trusting in my own power here. I'm trusting in his. I'm not trying to blaze a new trail of the Christian life. I'm putting my feet where he put his feet. And he was able to walk through the crowd, subjected to scorn, pain, and hostility, and come out the other side. And you can too. Now, this text, it's a deep one. It has multiple layers and notes. That's the book of Hebrews for you. I think if we just read this section, we'd think that the stuff that comes at us from the outside is only evil continually. When someone on the outside says something to you that you're insecure about, and then you feel insecure, you're like, that was just totally evil, right? It's Satan trying to get at me. That's entirely possible. But the text wants to say maybe there's another side of that coin. Maybe God is helping you develop endurance in this particular issue. Listen to this. Verse 5. Have you forgotten the encouraging words God spoke to you as his children? He said, my child, don't make light of the Lord's discipline. Don't give up when he corrects you, for the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes each one he accepts as a kid. As you endure this divine discipline, remember that God is treating you as his own children. Who ever heard of a child who's not disciplined by their father? Lots of modern people have heard about that. It was nonsense in his age. If God doesn't discipline you, as he does all of his children, maybe you should be scared. It might mean you're illegitimate, not really a child at all. Since we respected our earthly fathers who disciplined us, shouldn't we submit even more to the discipline of the Father of our spirits and live forever? This could be triggering, because some of us endured discipline that was really just punishment. Some of us had authority figures in our life, maybe dads, maybe moms, maybe coaches, maybe teachers, who really didn't have good intentions for us. Maybe tried to live through us and held us to unreasonable expectations. Maybe tried to just chop us down so that we wouldn't outshine them. Maybe just were mad at you and wanted you to feel the pain of their anger. Most people have experienced some level of abuse like that in their life. That is not the discipline that the author of Hebrews is talking about with God here. That's a discipline to chop you down. The discipline of God is to build you up. And he disciplines those he loves. Don't think about pain in your life with current circumstances as God is punishing me for doing something wrong. Maybe instead he's saying, hey, your running form needs a little work. Can I coach you a little bit? And a good coach sees the blind spots of their athletes and is willing to point out the bad form, and not just point it out and complain, but come up with exercises to make it better. Verse 10, for our earthly fathers disciplined us for only a few years, doing the best they knew how. But God's discipline is what? That should change the way you're running your race. If it's painful and it's hard right now, maybe you're experiencing some godly discipline to cultivate some righteousness in you. And you should know that the process and the product is good. You got a bad coach if they're not willing to point out the ways that you're stinking up your race. Has anybody seen the movie McFarland USA? It's not a super popular one. Okay, nice. Your homework this week is to watch the movie McFarland USA. It's Kevin Costner, right? That's the name of that dude? Yeah. It's worth watching. Because the author of Hebrews tells us in verse 11a, no discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful. So this story of McFarland USA is this big-time coach has a falling out, and he ends up in this little podunk town. I believe it's in Southern California, close to the border, but I could be wrong. And he ends up coaching at this high school anything he can. Well, all that he can coach there is cross country. And so he goes to this team, and they are terrible. But he realizes quickly that this is a community of pickers, of largely immigrant workers who have kids who are going to the schools, and those kids get up with their parents before the sun and stay after it sets, picking in the fields, even though they go to school in between. And he identifies in those people a crazy amount of perseverance and endurance and strength. And so he picks some of them to try to run. He has to teach them how to run, but he sees the endurance in them. In fact, one of them is picking so far from school that by the time he finishes picking in the morning, the only way for him to make it to school in time is to run. His situations have made him a natural-born runner. And so he starts coaching these people, and he realizes, wow, they actually have a ton of natural talent. And so he takes them to their first meet, and they're pumped up. They're ready. But the end of that first meet is this huge uphill section. And the place where they're living in McFarland, USA is flatter than flat. There are no hills. The only hills there, in fact, are created artificially by the byproducts of harvesting food. So he sees his runners running this race. But then even his best runner, when he comes to the hill, he's been running his whole life out of necessity, gets to the hill, and he's in front, and he just slowly, the lead keeps going, and people are passing him, and he's getting defeated. And the last guy can barely even make it up the hill, and I think he just kind of falls down afterwards. He's got a little bit too much weight and hurts his knees. So what does a good coach do? He doesn't rip into them. You guys are absolutely terrible. I think he actually does a little bit, but that wouldn't be a godly coach. Instead, he says, I didn't train you to run hills. So guess what? We're going to learn to run hills. And he finds this area outside of the town where almond husks, the outside of the stuff that's necessary for you to get the nut that you like, the finished product, are mounded up and covered over with plastic sheets. And so there's, as far as the eye can see, there's these mounds. And he says, this is where we're running from now on. You don't need help on the straightaways. You need to run the mountains. You need to learn how to run uphill and downhill. And so these people are going to town, and eventually his best runner comes up to him. He's broken. I can't run like this. I thought I could run. He wants to quit the team. Don't quit your race with God, because there's some uphill stretches you don't feel prepared for. If you keep encountering the same spiritual issue, maybe it's the case that God is coaching you how to run it better. Maybe you're developing some muscle memory and new muscle groups where you're going to be able to succeed where you've previously failed. I don't think God's discipline is constantly before us. Why do I keep encountering the same tempting situation, God? Like, what is going on? You know this is an area of issue. He says, I know. That's why we're training in this area. You don't need help over here. You need help here. What is your spiritual uphill struggle? We've all got one. Maybe it's that you don't have patience with somebody else, or you flip off to anger right away, or lust is dominating your life, or greed and the pride of life is making you sacrifice things for church or for other people, whatever. I don't know what it is. But it shouldn't surprise you that you continue to encounter issues in your areas of weakness. Maybe it's just outside pain, but maybe it's God disciplining you because he loves you and he wants you to do better, and he wants you to be able to train others to run the race well as well. No discipline's enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful. Here's the back half of that verse, though. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. Learning to run the race with endurance has its rewards. Here's what I want to pretty well leave you with today is God's discipline, no matter how it feels, is good. Change the way you look at your problems. And here's a way to identify it. What's the area of your life, just practically speaking, where you feel like you're disconnected and alienated the most from where God would want you to be? Think on that and think of how that's occurring in your life. And then maybe pray that through. God, if this is it, help me see when I encounter these issues, not as traps for me to fall, but instead exercises for me to build some spiritual muscles to become who you've asked me to be. This is the last line that I'm going to hit you with from chapter 12, and I love it. Just because he knows, the author of Hebrews knows what it's like to struggle with endurance. Oh, it's good. Ooh, it's good. We get chills. So take a new grip with your tired hands. Anybody feel like you have tired hands? And strengthen your weak knees. I know what it's like too. Not for the same issues. And then here's the practical part. Mark out a straight path for your feet so that those of you who are weak and lame will not fall, but become strong. Today, if you're struggling, I think the author of Hebrews is saying you need a new race plan. You need to allow the areas of your life that are struggles to become coachable moments and see them as opportunities rather than obstacles. So, here's your homework. You need to watch McFarland USA because it'll tie the whole service together. And you might learn some other things as well. But beyond that, do something for me. Read the rest of Hebrews chapter 12 and all of chapter 13. That may seem like it's long. It's not. If you're single, read it by yourself and talk with a good friend about it who's a Christian. If you're married, read it and talk about it with your spouse. If you have kids, when you're done talking with your spouse, talk with your kids if they're old enough to be able to grasp this at any level. And I think most of them can. He's going to outline, the author, so many ways that we can have build spiritual exercises into our life and lots of things that we should avoid. I want you to read that with your spouse and allow, because we're running the race together, you're not in a spiritual competition against your spouse or your kids or your pastor. We're running this together. Allow the people closest in your life to become a coach for you. Highlight your weaknesses and devise a game plan. Simple things this week that you could do to run the race with endurance, develop new muscle groups, and change the way you're looking at your problems. We all get weak in the knees. We all get weak in the mind. Remember 3 things from the author of Hebrews. You're running the race together, not against anyone else. Use each other to reach your spiritual goals. 2, you're not always going to feel like running. And in the middle of the race, you might want to quit. But just because there's no one cheering you on in the middle of the race doesn't mean they're not at the finish line waiting. When you're running cross country, there's these long stretches where you see nobody and you're not even sure if you're on the right path. But when you come around the end, you see everybody cheering. There's a spiritual cloud of witnesses that are cheering for you, even when you can't hear them or feel them. They're not just icing their knees in heaven. They've turned around and they're cheering you on. And finally, just remember, in all things, Jesus is one step in front of you. So put your feet where he has put his. He's not just run the race himself and left us to figure it out. The Holy Spirit inside of you can be a perfect coach, the perfecter of our faith, the one who speaks the right words in the right way at the right time. Everybody who's been coached has heard a bad word from their coach. You don't get that from God. He's better. He's the best. Remember, when the discipline doesn't feel pleasant, running rarely feels pleasant. But you're running a race for a reason. The goal and the prize and the destination is worth it. So let's run the race together with endurance. And let's help each other come up with a better race plan.